Hello everyone. Tonight we start with Imperial China, one of the most sophisticated, orderly, and magnificent civilizations in history. It established norms in the fields of philosophy, science, art, military, and bureaucracy for more than 2,000 years. Although the Forbidden City may appear stunning from a distance, if you had lived there, your life would have been everything from glitzy, so don't get ahead of yourself. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to the video before you settle in, but only if you truly like what I do here. Additionally, tell me in the comments what time it is for you and where you are tuning in from. Seeing who is joining us from around the globe is always exciting. Let's ease into tonight's voyage together by turning down the lights and possibly turning on a fan to provide a gentle background hum. Welcome to Imperial China, where society kindly throws you a roll and then folds it shut as soon as you leave the womb. The social structure can be compared to a multi-layered cake with you as the stale bottom layer and the frosting never dripping down. The Emperor, also called the Son of Heaven, is at the very top. It's a beautiful title until you understand that heaven doesn't accept complaints. He governs according to the decree of heaven, which means that his divine status will not be contested as long as the crops are growing and there are no uprisings. Weep if things don't work out. I suppose heaven has altered its mind. A new dynasty is needed. The scholar officials sit beneath him. These guys have bent backs from a lifetime of bamboo scrolls and social superiority, have memorized Confucian books for the majority of their lives, and quote philosophy without being asked. If failing meant eternal poverty, they passed the imperial examinations, which were basically the SATs. The farmers come next. Yes, society's muddy, sunburned and malnourished backbone. In fact, they were praised by Confucian theory because, after all, they provided food for the empire. Sadly, lunch breaks and dental care are not synonymous with respect. Then came artisans who created things by hand using paper, porcelain, fans, and impatience. Beneficial? Of course. Honored? Not at all. At least they weren't traders, though. Merchants, wealthier than all, and untrusted. Profiting from the labor of others was morally dubious in the eyes of Confucian principles. Even if you are dressed in silk and silver, you might still be viewed as a tax-evading raccoon wearing a brocade dressing gown. Then we arrive at the basement of society. Actors, crooks, butchers, servants, and soldiers. At a formal banquet, that is, someone you wouldn't want to sit next to. And monks, too. Between holy man and why you're bald and barefoot in public, there's a grey area. Lastly, ladies, not even on the pyramid. They resembled the gravel around it more. They were raised to obey their fathers, passed on to obey their spouses, and were supposed to have boys who would eventually be able to obey more men. There was only one solution available to society if you were born in Imperial China and wanted to pursue your goals. That's very cute. Return to your work now. Because of the yelling and the clanging of the village bell, which seems to be an attempt to call upon the afterlife, your day in Imperial China begins bright and early, not because you're a morning person. You stretch your limbs, open your eyes, and realize instantly that you are not permitted to simply exist. You bow first, not to a lofty ideal or abstract god, to your father, then your mother, then your grandfather. If your great aunt is still alive, perhaps to her. It is not only promoted, but filial piety. It is required. Don't remember to bow. It's not disrespectful to do that. That would bring cosmic disgrace upon 7 generations of your family. You also bow more than once. You bow gradually. When you awaken, you bow. Before you eat, you bow. When someone who is older than you coughs at you, you bow. Are you even Chinese if you don't bow at least 6 times before breakfast? Let's imagine you unintentionally interrupt someone with morning tea. Perhaps you inquired as to why I was required to wash Uncle's feet. Congratulations then. In terms of social dishonor, you have now engaged in unfilial conduct, which is just a little worse than public arson. It would be wise to begin practicing your apologies with 3 complete kowtows and, if desired, a forehead-to-floor touch. Indeed, you are being judged by the furniture as well. Except for the wealthy, most homes lacked chairs. As your elders begin their 45-minute lectures about discipline, respect, and how the world has been declining since the last dynasty, you are kneeling on woven mats and attempting to keep your composure. The Confucian hierarchical chart should not be overlooked. Who gets to speak, sit, or breathe first is determined by the spiritual PowerPoint slide. Youth is outshone by age. Women are ranked lower than men. Fathers are superior to everyone else. You can be overheard by elder siblings as well. Simply nod, smile, and pray. You're not held responsible for someone else's actions if you're the youngest. In Imperial China, there is no such thing as a pleasant morning. There are only a few polite customs and a silent hope that you won't unintentionally offend someone today and be shunned. Before 7 a.m., you have bowed about 47 times. Congratulations, you've made it through the day's opening ceremony. To remind you that life is painful, it's time for breakfast, the most significant meal of the day. What's on the menu then? We'll see. Congee, which is a kind way of expressing hot, wet nothing, is a steaming bowl of rice gruel. Rice is boiled in water until it gives up and turns into soup. It contains some salt if you're lucky. A stray piece of pickled vegetable may float by like a rare koi if you're extremely fortunate. That bowl of congee is about as thrilling as your social prospects if your family is on the lower end of the socio-economic scale, which, let's face it, includes you. You consume it in silence, with deference, and while at least one grandparent, who recalls a time when even gruel was considered a luxury, watches over you. Meat? Don't even inquire. That is for imperial officials who haven't been to a rice paddy since the Han era, as well as for festivals and weddings. Though they are typically stored in ash or salt until they resemble fossilized melancholy, eggs are possible. You instantly look for visiting family members or supernatural intervention if someone brings out pork belly. Naturally, tea is offered because plain water is questioned, not to unwind. At least tea is statistically less likely to harm you because it has been boiled. Even though your stomach is still unsure of when the meal began, you take a careful drink. You eat in silence in the meantime. Meals aren't meant for conversation. You don't talk about your aspirations, your aims, or how you sobbed last night when contemplating the Imperial exam. Despite the fact that your ancestors left you with a thatched roof, severe anemia, and unachievable family expectations, you silently express your gratitude for them as you dine in front of the ancestral shrine. The ceramic bowls are rough. Wood is used to make the spoons. No napkin is present. If your sleeve is clean enough, you wipe your mouth with it before beginning to work off the meal you hardly ate. And your father gives you a single nod as you stand up. Eat fast. The industrious are favored in heaven. It generally means return to your task. We need to preserve our dynasties. After finishing your bowl of existential porridge, it's time to put on your clothes. To avoid being reprimanded, flogged, or thought to belong to a higher social class, not to impress. Because clothing was not a means of expressing one's individuality in Imperial China. It's a matter of survival. First, let's talk about fabric hierarchy. Do you work as a farmer? Hemp. Hemp that is rough, scratchy, and irritating. Wearing a potato sack soaked in disappointment was the medieval equivalent. Are you a lord? Silk. Beautiful, glistening silk that whispers and flows like poetry. Increase taxes on peasants, and you know what? You are not only out of style if you are caught wearing the incorrect fabric, you are breaking the law. Clothing was required by law, not merely for comfort. The government established strict rules over belt decorations, hat shapes, sleeve width, and even color. For example, the emperor alone was allowed to use yellow. If you wear yellow as a regular person, you're starting your own execution rather than a fashion trend. Let's discuss shoes. Peasants wore cloth shoes while the rich wore silk slippers with embroidery. Realistic? Not required. Coziness? Not likely. You dressed for the dynasty rather than the weather. The feet come next, in particular foot binding, as aesthetically pleasing as curling your toes into a secret. From the age of 5, if you were a girl of noble birth, your feet were bound firmly, folded under, and broken. Why? Because lotus feet, tiny, malformed feet, were regarded as attractive. The ability of a lady to limp across a room without falling was a literal indicator of her value. Not only was it unpleasant, but it was irreversible. Generations of women were afflicted by foot binding, which made walking both painful and an artistic endeavor. Don't worry, though. Since it was no longer truly possible to go far, at least you could wear embroidered shoes that no one ever noticed. Men were not exempt from clothing anguish, because status always took precedence over perspiration. Bureaucrats wore bulky, layered robes all year long, even during the summer. In order to prevent officials from speaking to one another in court, some of the uniforms even had winged hat flaps. Therefore, it is true that Imperial Chinese fashion was sophisticated, symbolic, and intensely political. However, it also caused your bones to be squeezed, chafed, overheated, or broken completely. They say that beauty is suffering. Here, however, beauty was a dress code sanctioned by the government, and suffering was required. Now you're dressed appropriately in your potato fiber tunic, which is socially acceptable. Fantastic. If the land, weather, and taxes permit, it's time to go out and get your daily calories. Let's be truthful. It was not a calling to work in Imperial China. Confucius created the never-ending endurance test, which was administered by individuals who had never handled a shovel in their lives. You will spend your entire life hunched over a rice paddy if you are a farmer, which is what statistics show you are. Not in a romantic, film-like manner. No, this is actual labor that breaks the back. You rise before the morning, sow seedlings knee-deep in mud, ward off insects the size of little birds, and hope that this year's landlord won't raise your grain tax. Rain? You have a job. A drought? You put in more effort. Locusts? Scream at the heavens and work at the same time. The equipment is simple. If you're lucky, a wooden plow. If you're not, your naked hands. Your retirement plan and greatest friend are your ox. If you lose him, you'll be up against 10 acres of disappointment. Now imagine that you are a woman. You have a sequel to your workload. Even if you cook, clean, spin thread, weave fabric, raise kids, and assist in the fields, you will still be held accountable when your spouse sneezes incorrectly or dinner is late. Sleep? That's what ladies of distinction do when they debate poetry. The situation for artisans is not much better. You labor for hours creating tools, paper, or ceramics, then sell them for just enough money to purchase stale tofu. And traders? Richer in theory, but socially disgraced. You would still be viewed as a moral failure even if you were to purchase half the village. Then there is government-mandated duty or corvée work. The emperor might eventually require a new canal, road, or tomb. You know who's smiling and barefoot, working to build it for free? You. You risk being labeled a criminal or, worse, a rebel if you don't comply. And then it's all over. Covered in filth, you plod home to a bowl of weak porridge and the silent joy of surviving today. Working did not provide you freedom in Imperial China. Simply put, it keeps you too exhausted to rebel. Oh, the system of imperial exams, the great starting point for upward mobility, or as it is more correctly called, China's perpetual written torture chamber. Your life's course was obvious if you were a man born with a glimmer of ambition and a family that was marginally wealthier than dirt. Ace the civil service test. Be successful. You would also be made an official, honored, strong, with real seats to sit on and silk robes. Failing? Simple, not even near, back to the rice fields. These tests were less multiple choice and more about writing eloquent essays that would move a 1,000-year-old ghost to tears and learning the entire Confucian literature by heart. Imagine having your handwriting evaluated not only on its meaning and syntax, but also on whether it flows like a morally pure river. Just one smudge, a single character that doesn't belong, too edgy for one metaphor, failure in a flash. Studying started early in life and continued until your hairline appeared. Boys scribbled dissertations till their fingers turned into permanent brush-holding claws while cooped up in icy study huts or boiling themselves to death in the summer. Tutors were like academic blacksmiths drilling ideology into your brain. Your social life, lost. Your interests, Confucius. Your aspirations, Confucius notwithstanding. The capital hosted the jinshi, the highest exam. You were confined to a coffin-sized cubicle with only paper, ink, and heartbreaking fear. You brought your own chamber pot, blanket, and food. While some examinees passed out, others lost their minds. They weren't even given half credit, and several of them physically perished from the strain. More tests were ahead, even if you made it through the initial round. National, provincial, and district. Years may pass. Years. A few guys tested well into their 60s. According to reports, one man took the test over 40 times. That is trauma with a calligraphy pen, not resolve. What if you didn't succeed? Social disgrace. Your family would be really disappointed because they gave up everything for your schooling. Your neighbors would mutter. Your mom may cry. It's possible that your father will give you the "why weren't you born smarter" look. Therefore, the test has the power to either make you a wonderful person or destroy your body, mind, and heritage. All for the opportunity to be micromanaged by palace eunuchs, overworked and underpaid. Is it worthwhile? Confucius is in charge of that. Do you feel unclean yet? You will, don't worry. Because personal cleanliness was more of a seasonal recommendation than a way of life in Imperial China. Let's begin with the fundamentals. Taking a bath? It took place, occasionally. If you were lucky enough not to freeze to death, maybe once every few weeks, yes. In the summer, a river dip. During the winter, you might not give yourself a good wash for a month. And no, there was no soap with a lavender smell. When soap was used, it was a gritty mixture of animal fat and ashes that felt like exfoliating with suffering. There were public baths, particularly in bigger cities. However, there was no such thing as privacy. In the corner, a monk would be reciting hygiene proverbs while you scrubbed your armpits alongside an elderly merchant and a screaming toddler. Revitalizing. Toothpaste? Try powdered bones, salt, or charcoal. Bamboo was tied with animal hair to make toothbrushes. It would only work if you wanted to gently move your plaque around. The majority of elderly people likely had ghoulish smiles because of poor dental health. And the parasites came next: bedbugs, fleas, and lice. There were more housemates and fewer pests. It made no difference how wealthy you were. You had company if you had hair, because everyone needs a lice comb. Comb shops grew. What if you didn't? You scratched your scalp as if to call forth lightning. Clothes didn't help either. You'd spent weeks wearing the same attire. To wash clothes, you had to carry water, boil it, scrub by hand, and hope your shirt didn't break into fibers. Although they were available, underwear was not a daily necessity, particularly for peasants who frequently wore none at all. Dangerous enterprise, not to mention the restrooms. Or, better yet, do it for yourself. Traditionally, a toilet was a pit in the ground with wooden boards around it if you were feeling fancy. The same way a haunted well is practical, so are public restrooms, congested, foul-smelling, and constantly on the verge of a biological catastrophe. Silk, philosophy, poetry, and palaces were all features of Imperial China. You were, however, roughly 1,500 years too early if you desired a lengthy, hot, private shower. You've made it through the heartbreaking exam preparation, the lice, and the disappointing breakfast. However, keep in mind that the law is constantly on guard in Imperial China before you even consider complaining to your neighbor. In contrast to contemporary surveillance, this one uses bamboo whips and quite inventive penalties. First, let's talk about the legal code. Imperial empires were renowned for having incredibly intricate regulations, especially during the Tang and Qing eras. Taxes, hairstyles, hat designs, proper grieving techniques, and the length of time you may mourn your in-laws were all governed by regulations. Wearing the incorrect color on the wrong festival day by accident? Illegal, in theory. They did, in fact, keep receipts. Official bamboo strip documents, signed and filed by scribes who were overworked and often detested their jobs. It wasn't a subtle punishment. Forget about community service and contemporary courtrooms. Imperial justice promoted suffering as a means of instruction. You could receive a bamboo rod flogging for small infractions. Intriguingly, the size of the sticks in the court varied according to the offence. Slight offence, little stick. A chicken was stolen, larger stick. Did you not bend before a magistrate's horse deeply enough? Surprise stick combination. Crimes that were more serious quickly escalated. You might be exiled, have your crime permanently inked on your face, be branded, or, if you truly enraged someone significant, be put to death in front of others. Slowly. Torture was no different. It was protocol. The court would frequently utilize thumbscrews, kneeling on sharpened boards, or long periods of tension while being yelled at by a man with a scroll and no sense of humor to entice your confession if you were accused of something. The finest part comes next. It was not even necessary for you to be guilty. Simply suspicious, awkward, or unlucky politically. You can even be held responsible for your family. Collective punishment was a favorite of the law. Since guilt was supposedly inherited, you might wake up to find your home under investigation if your relative blurted anything seditious during a rice wine binge. The legislation was organized. It was sophisticated. It was horrible. In Imperial China, justice was more about obedience than fairness. It was an obvious message. Act. Observe the order. Additionally, avoid looking at the magistrate's concubine at all costs. Welcome to the favorite pastime of the imperial justice system, torture, as a convenient pre-trial icebreaker, not as a form of punishment. Imagine if someone accuses you of insulting your father, stealing a chicken, or, worse, having a strong opinion on the Empress' poetry. The magistrate doesn't begin by requesting your version of events. No, no, Imperial China is this. As they pull out the confession tools, you are first restrained to a bench. The bamboo rod, which is used to strike your thighs, buttocks, or back until you apologize for offenses you might not even comprehend, comes first. The violence wasn't sporadic. In their official punishment diaries, they meticulously recorded each strike. 1 bonus lash for squirming, 30 for stealing, and 45 for lying. Are you still denying your guilt? It's time to modernize. A classic was kneeling on spiky boards. Until your legs give out, or your will does, you kneel on rough wood that has been embedded with glass or stones. If irate public officers invented yoga, it would be quite similar. Then there's the finger crusher, which consists of 2 wooden slabs that are rope-tightened around your fingers. It was known as the little tiger bench, which is a fun tidbit until your bones start to break, like kindling. They didn't really care about handwriting, but it's difficult to write a confession with damaged fingers. It was routine protocol, to be sure. There was no moral doubt about torture. It was just the most effective approach to obtain the truth, or at least the version that aligned with the official story. They would just escalate if you didn't confess. Stretching, whipping, or being tied up in the hot sun while officials had a lunch break were some of the penalties. Additionally, the neighbors are accustomed to it, so don't bother yelling. Now pretend that you are innocent. Congratulations, you will continue to be tortured because accurate documentation required a clean confession. Admitting anything is preferable to running the risk of being called uncooperative, imperial reasoning at its best. The DMV doesn't beat you with bamboo until you acknowledge that you could have parked incorrectly in 1372, so keep that in mind the next time you gripe about contemporary bureaucracy. Even if you might feel isolated, there is always someone monitoring in Imperial China. No, it's not just your granny who is critical. The state of surveillance was not digital, it was a person. Terrifyingly thorough, state-approved and meticulously trained. Every town had a local baojang, or village leader, who served more purposes than simply distributing rice. This was where it all started. Additionally, he was your amiable neighborhood informant. Your neighbors? Spies too. Your whole family? Completely spying. Your servant, who says he is deaf and illiterate? Unquestionably a spy. People were incentivized to report suspect activity, and suspicious may mean anything from hoarding too much grain to coughing during a tribute speech. Being overly silent could also draw attention. Citizen, what are you concealing? You had an intricate system of scribes, magistrate assistants, and yamen runners in the cities who were there to convey messages, look into crimes, and obliquely watch everything you did. Although this mechanism was different in each dynasty, the objective was always the same. Look through every crevice you can to keep the peace. The eunuchs, castrated courtiers who were incapable of fathering children, but were capable of launching coups, were particularly fond of monitoring at the imperial palace. Many ran spy networks, managed their own covert police units, and whispered in Emperor's ears. Because they knew who said what to whom and when, some eunuchs had greater authority than ministers. Additionally, don't even attempt to criticize the system. Even a subtle criticism of the emperor, such as "the sun looks a little tired today," may be construed as slander. The skill of subtlety was mastered by poets. The others simply became experts at keeping quiet. Even worse, the government frequently releases warning lists of executed criminals, replete with names and offenses. With more beheadings, it resembled an old-fashioned Facebook feed. Therefore, you kept your rebellious thoughts to yourself. If your cousin was disobedient, you turned him in. Additionally, you should pretend to cough and flee if someone asked you about your political views and smiled too broadly. Because the walls had ears in Imperial China, the trees, your neighbors, and most likely, your rice bowl also did. It was not about falling in love among the cherry blossoms to get married in Imperial China. Duty, haggling, and dowries so large they could shatter the axle of your ox cart were all part of it. Love? Not for humans, but for poetry. Let's begin with the fundamentals. Marriages were always arranged. While you were still learning to hold chopsticks, your parents made the decision that would determine your future. A matchmaker, a professional spy who compared horoscopes, family records, and whether your future spouse's ancestors had ever committed an embarrassing act 5 dynasties ago, would be hired if your family had prestige. Congratulations! If all went according to plan, you are engaged. To a person you have most likely never met. Attraction on a physical level? Character? Similar passions? Irrelevant? Tax data and birth charts were used to gauge compatibility. Marriage wasn't a thrilling new phase for women. The kidnapping was done in ceremonial robes and was courteous. After moving into your husband's house, you left your family behind, changed your last name, and were now supposed to take care of him as well as his parents, grandparents, and any grumpy uncle who happened to be staying in the guest room. Your family was required to provide you money, goods, or land under the dowry system. The more the better. Consider that the ancient Chinese way of saying thank you for removing her from our grasp. Don't get overly enthusiastic when the groom's family offers betrothal gifts in exchange. Occasionally that meant jewelry and silks, sometimes a little better chicken. Your job was obvious once you were married. Never, ever argue back, obey your in-laws and have male heirs. Wives were supposed to be quiet, modest, and industrious. The Confucian feminine holy trinity. A concubine may lawfully replace you if you were too noisy, too opinionated, or, heaven forbid, infertile. In relation to that, concubinage did exist. Especially if they were wealthy, men were allowed to have more than one concubine. Ladies, one guy, one chance to live. Divorce? Uncommon. Social suicide. 7 outs, such as jealousy, illness, or excessive gossip, were the only justifications that were permissible. Therefore, your husband might lawfully divorce you if your tea-drinking habits irritate him sufficiently. Good. To put it succinctly, marriage in Imperial China was less fulfilled and more about avoiding exile for serving cold noodles. You're considering revolting, then? Perhaps you're sick of constant bowing, back-breaking labor, or that arrogant magistrate who taxed both your dignity and your rice in the same afternoon. A brave step. Regretfully, insurrection did not make one a hero in Imperial China. You had a fairly brief headline as a result. First, let's discuss the fantasy. You burn your landlord's tax ledgers, assemble a motley crew of peasants, and usher in a magnificent new age of justice. The issue? 3 days later, the Imperial army shows up with crossbows, horses, and no sense of humor. The emperors weren't merely high-ranking officials, you see. Stability was their obsession. According to Confucian philosophy, rebellion equated to chaos, which in turn indicated that the universe was out of balance. That turned you into a cosmic threat in addition to a criminal. And the penalty for dangers to the cosmos? Dramatic. You would be taken prisoner, paraded, tormented, and frequently put to death in a manner intended to stifle original thought. Beheadings in public were common. Quartering was also a factor. One emperor had a fondness for slow slicing, a lovely technique in which you were continually sliced until your torso and paperwork were finished. And it wasn't just you. A good collective punishment was adored by the imperial authorities. Everyone was fair game, including your neighbors, family, and even the guy who borrowed you a hoe once. The reasoning was straightforward. Nobody will rebel again if we wipe out your entire community. Efficient, horrible. Rebellions did, however, occur. Every now and then, desperate people rebelled, from the White Lotus Uprising to the Yellow Turban Rebellion. And the most were mercilessly squashed, yet some caused mayhem. The surviving were either silenced, sold into slavery, or forced to labor on public works projects that they would not live to complete. It was risky to even discuss revolt. Composing a sardonic poetry that expressed dissatisfaction, boom, arrested. Under bamboo interrogation, confess. Hopefully, you are banished to the distant regions to reflect on your behavior. Somewhere, purposefully, flea-infested, rocky, and chilly. Yes, it seemed romantic to rebel, the stuff of legends and plays. In actuality, though, you were more likely to end up as a warning story etched on a public monument. Do you wish to alter the system? Keeping your head down is best, literally. Perhaps you reasoned that if I couldn't succeed as a peasant, perhaps I could advance through the ranks, do well on tests, and lead a nice life as a government official. Cute, yes. The tea is hot, the robes are silk, and the palace floors are polished to a heavenly sheen. Welcome to court life in Imperial China. However, the knives that lurk behind everyone's backs are also present. Let's start with the Emperor's fiercely fortified paradise, the Forbidden City. Everyone is grinning inside and making plans. Scholar officials, concubines, ministers, and eunuchs. They are all engaged in a never-ending game of courteous betrayal. Actual throat-cutting, which also occurred, was the only thing more ruthless than court life. A great deal. Every action you took as an official was observed, adversaries who were waiting for you to make a mistake, not simply spies, using the incorrect character when filing a report, treason, during a reading, mispronounce the Emperor's name. Treason. Are you hesitant to kneel? At minimum, it is adjacent to treason. Let's also discuss the castrated royal slaves known as eunuchs, who possessed an excessive amount of power. Many began modestly, ascended quickly, and were appointed guardians of the emperor's inner world. A eunuch upset? Your name could be added to a covert, unintentional list of missing persons, or your promotion could be inexplicably delayed. The imperial harem, on the other hand, was not a romantic ideal. It was a political battleground with enormous stakes. Concubines sabotaged competitors, fought for favor, and aspired to have a prince. Ideally, one who was not poisoned before the age of 5. Although the Empress is officially in charge, good luck managing 30 envious women who have nothing better to do but plot ingeniously. Poetry was dangerous too. Someone might think you're disparaging the emperor if you write the incorrect metaphor about withering flowers or a collapsing wall. The emperor seized the message, and officials were put to death for penning weather-related poetry. When did the emperor pass away? Oh, the fun really started now. Please started. Secret wills, unexplained deaths, unlucky diseases, and succession disputes. Court life wasn't safer, as half of the court typically didn't make it through the transition. It was simply death wrapped in silk. Although your robe was red, the floor underneath it was also red. You've survived at least 3 different forms of death, bowed, bled, and committed 400 Confucian sayings to memory. The big picture of life in Imperial China, however, is as follows. You were a line item on an old tax ledger, a head count, a statistic. You were not seen by the empire as a person with aspirations. You were like a grain of rice, little, nameless, easily crushed, and best used for work or money. Your desire, talent, or inner beauty were irrelevant to the state. If your family produced physically fit sons to be drafted into the next border defense project and paid taxes on time, it mattered. You were a mere speck amid hundreds of millions, and not even a glamorous one in the emperor's eyes. You were neither a holy relic nor the golden imperial seal. In order to maintain dynastic continuity, you were a moving component of a machine that produced rice, spun silk, and dug canals. Your birth was noted for future tax purposes rather than for celebration. The main reason your death was recorded was to prevent your relatives from continuing to try to claim your rations. In the meanwhile, your life's work was to avoid trouble, follow the rules, play your part, and avoid starvation during a drought. Self-reliance, adorable concept. It was non-existent. You failed to pursue your passion. You obeyed your master, your father, or the bureaucratic status you were given. As dangerous to the state as a Mongol invasion or a crop plague was the notion of being different, of sticking out, was all about harmony, was even expected that your feelings would reflect your social standing. Are you depressed as a peasant? All right. Are you feeling motivated? Take a seat. Your favorite poetry was not a question on the census. It inquired as to whether you had a pig and whether your roof leaked. Your body was part of the system too. If you are drafted for public works, you can be assigned to defend a wall that will never be completed or construct a canal that you will never use. Perish in the process? No issue. Where you came from, there were always more grains. You were important in Imperial China, but only if you could be taxed, tallied, or buried in peace. Now that we are 15 chapters in, one thing is evident to those who have been paying attention. China's imperial era was both glorious and incredibly cruel. Indeed, this civilization is largely responsible for some of the world's most significant inventions, including printing, the compass, paper, gunpowder, and functional bureaucracy. The Forbidden City loomed like a diamond of imperial will. The Great Wall weaved its way across mountains, and poetry flowed like the Yellow River. Beautiful, boundless, and frequently lethal if misunderstood. The heritage, unrivaled. The truth, backbreaking, hierarchical, and always on the verge of collapse due to a poor rice harvest. 10,000 peasants were knee-deep in muck, wondering if this year's tax grain would leave them with something to eat for every beautiful brushstroke that was documented in a scholar's diary. Because they were inconvenient witnesses, hundreds of workmen were buried beneath each emperor's jade and gold mountain. Imperial China's genius did not come easily. It was funded with missed childhoods due to test preparation, hunched backs from field work, and lives cut short by famine, conscription, or the law. For the top few, the system was marvelously effective. It worked for everyone else until they fell apart. What's the worst? Since the system had persuaded them that filial piety, obedience, and silence were virtues, that suffering in silence was a kind of virtue, and that heaven had designated their monarch, the majority of them embraced it, not because they enjoyed oppression. That legacy, the contrast between beauty and pain, remains relevant today. The calligraphy, architecture, and philosophical quotations etched into stone are frequently seen as people reflect on Imperial China. They don't always see the impoverished mother selling her comb for rice, the concubine poisoned in the harem, or the scholar who just vanished after failing the exam for the 8th time. You wouldn't survive in Imperial China for that reason. That planet wasn't made for survival, not because you're weak. It was constructed for control, tradition, and endurance. Nevertheless, only a handful of their tales were ever told, despite the fact that the empire and its citizens persevered through everything. The huge westward movement was well underway in the spring of 1846. With wagon wheels squeaking, oxen stumbling, and families hoping for fresh starts, the Oregon Trail was a hive of activity. A group of about 30 persons, led by businessman James F. Reed and brothers George and Jacob Donner, were among these travelers. They were neither explorers nor fortune-seekers. They pursued the promise of California's fertile valleys as moms, children, farmers, and artisans. They appeared to be at the ideal moment. The well-traveled west route had transported thousands of people before them, and the snows wouldn't come for months. However, the Donner Party, which eventually numbered 87 members, made a crucial mistake that would lead to disaster. They decided to cut corners. This so-called shortcut was the Hastings Cutoff, an unproven path advocated by opportunist Lansford Hastings, who had never even had a wagon ride on it. By passing across the Great Salt Lake Desert and Utah's Wasatch Mountains, it was supposed to decrease the trip time by weeks. In order to encourage emigrants to follow his new path, Hastings had dispatched guides ahead of time to leave letters. The Donner Party abandoned the conventional track and took his advice because they trusted those letters. Initially, everyone was in a good mood. Children, elderly parents, and whole families were among them. They sung hymns at night and clung to hope. However, problems soon arose. Hastings was mistaken about how dangerous the Wasatch Mountains were. It was necessary to disassemble the wagons, move them piece by piece, and then put them back together. Development slowed to a standstill. Supplies were running low and tensions were high. The desert followed. A cruel, glittering torment was the Great Salt Lake Desert. It would take 2 days to traverse, according to Hastings. 5 were needed. Barrels of water ran out. The animals fell to the ground. Oxen lost his mind. In the alkaline dust, entire carts were left behind. Winter was not far behind them, and they had already wasted valuable time. They had lost weeks by the time they returned to the main trail. The Sierra Nevada was already crossed by other wagon trains. Unaware that the most terrifying portion of their voyage was still to come, the Donner Party continued to move forward despite being worn out and behind schedule. Though the mountains didn't give a damn, they still harbored the hope of California. And soon, famine wouldn't either. The Donner Party eventually arrived at the eastern foot of the Sierra Nevada mountains by the end of October 1846. It was meant to be the final significant barrier before descending into the promised lands of California. But winter was coming early, and the mountains weren't just high, they were cruel. Now the party was divided. Broken wagons, wounded oxen, and sheer fatigue caused some families, like the Donners and the Reeds, to fall behind while others had pushed forward. Light at first, then unrelenting, the snow started to fall. The passes were inaccessible in a few of days. They were confined. Others halted farther back at Alder Creek, while others set up camp near Truckee Lake, now known as Donner Lake. They used wagon components and pine logs to construct makeshift cabins. The animals they had left were killed. They made rudimentary tents out of hides. The snow continued to fall, 6 feet and then 10. The hunger struck swiftly. There were less rations. The animals had vanished. They chewed on leather belts and cooked rawhide strips. A toddler attempted to consume a blanket. Another chewed till their gums were bleeding from chewing on a piece of bark. There was another cold body every morning. Slowly, courteously, then ruthlessly, death moved. There was no warmth in those cabins. Only quiet, hunger, and smoke. Mothers attempted to console youngsters who were malnourished. Fathers calculated how far they could walk while gazing out into the limitless snow. There were arguments, like the alpine air, hope dwindled. A snowfall on November 12th sealed their doom. The roofs were covered with snow. The weight caused trees to break. White quiet smothered any thoughts of escape. A single, desperate notion took the place of the dream of California as the pass was closed, living. When there was no sign of a rescue by the middle of December, 15 of the most tenacious members organized what would become known as the Forlorn Hope Party. With scant supplies and the indescribable weight of what might happen next, 10 men and 5 women strapped rudimentary snowshoes to their boots and tried to make their way across the mountains on foot. Dozens waited in a cold purgatory, starving and dying at the camp behind them. Furthermore, the Forlorn Hope did not have to worry about their survival, who would devour them and who would perish first. 15 desperate people disappeared into history on December 16, 1846, as they ventured out into the snow. The Forlorn Hope was their nickname. Their fellow exiles, who were fully aware of the meaning of the word forlorn, watched them leave, not the newspapers. Lost, bleak, doomed. Every member simply brought what they could: a rifle, shredded blankets, flint, and bits of dried oxhide. In an attempt to stay above the deep drifts, they constructed rudimentary snowshoes, but they were hardly effective. The snow seemed unending and powdery. Exhaustion and the cold clutch of high-altitude wilderness hindered them as they toiled for miles every day. They vanished in a matter of days. There was hardly any food left. The distance had been misjudged. A guy fell, a pine cone boiled, and a squirrel was captured. The group's eldest member, Franklin Graves, passed away in the snow while his daughters wept. They were powerless to stop it. Then others started to fall, one by one. The Mexican team player, Antonio, Patrick Dolan, dizzy and ranting. Lemuel Murphy was just 13 years old. Death arrived as a gradual silence rather than a storm. It was white, silent, and unavoidable. Then the time arrived. Desperation and cold logic crossed the line. Meat from the dead was carved by the surviving. They prayed, cried, puked, and then ate once more. It was not barbarism. Calculus was involved. Starve, or live. The initial taste was later remembered by 19-year-old Sarah Graves. She didn't bring it up again. Silent and thin, William Foster kept his thoughts to himself. Holding her sister's hand, Mary Ann Graves said that as long as they arrived home, it didn't matter what they had to do. Only 7 of them remained when they staggered out of the mountains weeks later. 2 guys and 5 ladies. Their mouths were silent, their cheeks were icy, and their eyes were sunken. However, they brought with them something considerably more potent than maps or supplies. They had news. Dozens of people were still alive and confined at Donner Lake. Waiting, freezing, and starving. And now they needed assistance. California awoke abruptly after mainly ignoring the Donner debacle. It was too terrifying. The embarrassment is too great. They coordinated rescue parties. However, the snow had gotten deeper by the time they got there, and they couldn't have imagined what they would discover at the cabins near the lake. 2 months after the Desolate Hope appeared in the mountains, the first rescue party reached Donner Lake in February 1847. They did not discover a camp. It was a cemetery. Doors were sealed shut and cabins were partially buried in snow. Inside, they sat still, too weak to move, their eyes glassy with hunger. Children were lying next to their deceased parents. Like firewood, frozen corpses were piled high. And as the meat ran out, the smell, thick, sickening and unforgettable, spoke of what had transpired. A few made an attempt to talk. Others just gazed. Almost half of the 87 who had embarked on the adventure had perished, and those who were still alive were hardly human at all, thin, bony beings dressed in dirty hides who were muttering prayers to a sky that didn't care. Though not enough to save everyone, the rescuers had brought blankets, flour, dried meat, and other supplies. Carrying dozens through snowdrifts taller than wagons was impossible. They were forced to make difficult choices. First, the lightest and smallest children were selected, those who stand the best chance of making it through the mountainous descent. Unsure if they would ever see their children again, parents remained behind and watched in silence as strangers took them away. 3 more rescue operations were placed over the course of the following 2 months. Each had to contend with terrain that had engulfed the Donner Party, avalanches, and whiteouts. The rescuers discovered fewer survivors and more somber tales on each subsequent return trip, and they also brought less supplies. The truth started to come to light. Of cannibalism, not merely of famine. How some survivors had gorged themselves on the corpses during the darkest hours when all was gone. Others had killed to feed, some even whispered. The rumors were more loud than the facts, and the names were kept under wraps. While some were pitied, others were criticized. The majority were just too traumatized to talk. Returning as a rescuer was James Reed, who had been exiled early in the expedition for killing a man in self-defense. He discovered his wife and kids still alive in spite of everything, but in Alder Creek, George Donner lay dying, his arm gangrenous. Tamsin, his wife, wouldn't leave him. When the rest departed, she remained and never left. The struggle ended when the last survivors arrived in California in April 1847. However, the historical, cultural, and emotional wounds were only starting to show. Like wildfire, word of the Donner Party's experience twisted eastward with each recounting, becoming more macabre and terrible. It was too much for newspapers. America was suddenly staring at its shadow as it suffered from manifest destiny fever. The narrative was too compelling to refuse. In the winter, pioneers seeking utopia became cannibals. It was referred to as the Sierra's Cannibal Horror in several headlines. Others charged survivors with homicide. It was a national reckoning, not just a scandal. It has always been argued that the westward advance was inevitable, divine, and wonderful. However, the idea of hungry settlers cooking human flesh over pinewood fires has now tarnished it. Every horrific detail was the focus of journalists' attention. Who consumed whom, who passed away honorably, and who died too slowly. One of the survivors, Sarah Graves, was harassed for interviews. Mary Murphy, who lost nearly her whole family, was also affected. Survivors faced criticism for their methods of survival, while also receiving acclaim for their survival. Once a humiliated exile, James Reed came back to San Jose a different man, haunted yet justified. He gained national pity for his leadership during the rescue operations, and he devoted a large portion of his following years to preserving the survivors' reputations. However, he was unable to stop the murmurs. Tamsin Donner, a loving wife who repeatedly refused assistance and remained with her dying husband, became a tragic figure. She never made it when she eventually attempted to depart with a group of men. Her destiny was unclear. Some claimed she died of a cold, while others claimed the men she trusted killed and consumed her. For its part, the government didn't say much. Officials didn't want to ruin the promise of westward development when California was about to become a U.S. territory. There was no formal investigation or inquiry, and the episode was dismissed as a terrible tragedy and an anomaly. Despite this, the Donners were discussed in every tavern and parlor. The name itself turned into a warning. Youngsters were cautioned not to take shortcuts or deviate from the path, because else they might become like them. But beneath the terror, there were deeper issues that persisted, such as morality, survival, and how flimsy civilization's facade is when the snow keeps coming. After the snow melted, the quest continued for those who survived the Sierra nightmare. The cost of survival was inscribed in memory and bone. Though they never really left them behind, the survivors came out of the mountains. There were a lot of kids. They were quiet, malnourished, and wide-eyed walking ghosts when they returned to civilization. Some would live long lives, such as Virginia Reed, who was only 13 at the time. She finally got married, had kids, and even wrote letters sharing her experience. However, beneath her calm exterior was trauma that throbbed like an old wound. Others had a terrible time. Mary Murphy married young and passed away within a few years after losing her entire family. Rumor had it that Louis Kesselberg, a German immigrant who had been one of the last to be saved, had not only eaten the corpses, but had also killed them in order to do so. He got $1 in damages after suing a newspaper for libel. It made no difference. He never got rid of the stain. A few survivors made an attempt to vanish. They refused to talk about what had happened, moved far from California, or changed their names. Others were unable to stop talking because they were haunted by both their own and other people's actions. The cannibalism wasn't the only thing. It was the gradual disintegration of humanity, witnessing friends turn into skeletons, listening to moms weeping silently because they were unable to provide for their children, and deciding who to save when help arrived because there was never enough space for everyone. Communities also responded in diverse ways. Some showed sympathy and reverence for the survivors, viewing their hardship as a sign of valiant perseverance. Others, anxious to get away from what had turned into a living hell enshrined in the mystique of the American frontier, murmured and gossiped. To his credit, James Reed's reputation was restored. He survived to old age, flourished in San Jose, and fought in the Mexican-American War. Even yet, he acknowledged in letters that the sounds of the camp and the pictures of the dead lingered in his mind. Always. Nobody who lived through the Donner Party came back unaltered. Regardless of their age, they had gazed into the emptiness of despair and made decisions that most people hope they will never have to make. And they left behind a fact that few wished to acknowledge in that hush between tragedy and hunger. It's not always easy to survive. It's not always honorable. Living with what you had to become is sometimes all that is required. The Donnas were never forgotten in the Sierra Nevada. Donna Lake, a postcard of natural beauty, with a name that hums with uneasiness, is now the lake where many of them waited out the blizzards, where they perished, starved, and nourished. The scenery eventually became a part of the myth. Visitors flocked to the location where the huts had previously been to stroll along the frozen paths where the hopeless pioneers had toiled and to admire the mountains that had obstructed their progress. Stories were told by locals. Some said that the trees still remembered, that the winds carried whispers, and that the place was cursed. A stone monument was placed close to the lake in 1918. A somber pioneer family, father, mother, and child, stands atop, looking westward with unwavering optimism. The height of the snow that winter is indicated by the 22-foot pedestal beneath them. It is a tribute to tragedy, perseverance, and the fine line separating civilization from survival. However, the story is still unsettling even in stone. Nothing about cannibalism, silent despair, treachery, or the dead who were eaten to keep others alive is mentioned in the monument. It is not historical truth, but a sanitized remembrance created for the convenience of the general people. School children visit the location annually. They listen to the rudimentary version. Trapped pioneers made it out alive, perhaps a reference to famine, almost never. Respecting grit is simpler than facing the costs of existence. The mountains, however, remember, the routes they traveled are still in existence, albeit hidden behind hiking trails and ski resorts. The location where Tamsin Donna and her dying husband remained. Interpretive plaques have taken the site of the cold cabin where kids cried silently and turned it into a picnic spot. Nevertheless, the air feels heavy, as though the ground still carries the memories of strangers sharing meat with quivering hands and turned-away eyes, of mothers rocking dead babies, and of boots crunching across snow. Nature is indifferent. It makes no excuses. However, the narrative continues. Not only is it terrifying, but it's also human. There was more to the Donner Party than cannibalism and failure. It dealt with the lengths people will go to in order to keep their families safe, to hold on to hope, and to choose life, even in its most dreadful form. And that decision continues to reverberate in the mountain solitude. The Donner Party's history changed throughout the ensuing decades as a result of recollections, rumors, and the demands of a drama-dependent country. Even while the facts were already graphic, storytellers continued to make them worse, or, in certain situations, more heroic. Some survivors were portrayed as tragic pioneers who had endured hell and returned with wounds, and they were glorified. Others, such as Louis Keseberg, turned into fictitious villains. He was charged with killing Tamsin Donna, hoarding food, and taking pleasure in the things he had to do to live. None of these charges were validated. However, truth was never given priority in the era of dime novels and printing mills. Extremes were popular. Nuance was not what they desired. Either monsters or martyrs were what they want. Life after survival became challenging as a result. Wounds were rekindled by every interview, newspaper illustration, and fictional recounting. A few survivors made an effort to correct the record. Years later, Virginia Reed wrote her own story. She pleaded with upcoming trailblazers to listen to those with experience and refrain from taking shortcuts. Others, burdened by the weight of their memories and the fascination of the world with them, remained silent. The Donner Party had become folklore by the late 19th century, a cautionary tale taught to schools, a campfire story spoken in whispers, a metaphor for ill-preparedness, hubris, and the consequences of following the wrong advice. The Hastings cutoff gained notoriety and came to represent lethal shortcuts. Over time, the cannibalism, the story's actual horror, became a cover for the deeper tragedy that the entire affair could have been avoided. More people died as a result of such poor leadership, conceited promises, and institutional inexperience than Snow ever did. However, the story's persistence has a distinctively American quality. It's a tale of obsession, movement, reinvention, and the hope of controlling fate and nature rather than merely one of failure. In addition to reflecting desperation, the Donner Party was a mirror reflecting the myth of westward perfection collapsing under its own weight. In actuality, there were only people making difficult decisions, neither heroes nor villains. And the question never really went away, even as time passed and the snow melted. How would you have responded? The Donner Party is now more than just a passing mention in American history. It is a skewed, contentious, and extremely unsettling symbol. This story, in contrast to others of pioneering fortitude, does not fit easily into the gallery of virtuous westward development. It's still a powerful story. Yes, we do recall the cannibalism, but it was merely the last act. Everything that preceded it is the true legacy, the delusion of shortcuts, the deadly force of incompetent leadership, and the trust placed in maps created by idealists rather than realistics. When the American dream was put to the test against the harsh apathy of nature, the Donner Party revealed how flimsy it was. However, we also discover something else in that collapse: endurance. The people that survived did not just descend from the mountains. They got married, had kids, and rebuilt. Others left California to avoid the rumors, while others remained. Some even achieved quiet prosperity. Their decision to pursue survival defined their life, not what they had done to get there. However, that survival comes at an eternal cost. The Donner Lake location remains intact and solemn. While reading inscriptions about bravery and hunger, visitors stroll among pine trees and melting snow. The voices of tour guides are quiet. Historians dispute the specifics. Authors are still unable to abandon the plot, because the Donner Party raises issues that history typically stays away from. What happens if the last option is the one you vowed never to select? What occurs when an icy tomb replaces the utopian dream? And does it matter how you get there if all that's left is survival? There are no satisfactory responses, only echoes. And hidden under the snow are bones. Ultimately, the Donner Party serves as a reminder that human strength is determined by resolve rather than glory. Not in victory, but in the awful, ruthless decision to continue living even when all the comforts, rules, and illusions of civilization have been taken away. Therefore, we honor them for what they went through as much as what they accomplished. Not as myths or warning stories, but as scared, resolute, fallible, and human beings. And their story, forever unfinished and frozen in time, continues to reverberate through the trees in the Sierra winds. Wu Zhao didn't come from a royal family. She was born into a much more perilous world of ambition cloaked in silk. The Tang dynasty was still in its infancy in 624 CE, and it was full of poetry and promise. Her father was a lumber trader, rich enough to provide his daughters books, teachers, and the radical notion that a girl's brain could be as keen as a boy's sword, among other uncommon luxuries. Wu Zhao was unique from a young age. Wu studied politics, history, and literature, while her contemporaries learnt needlework and the humble art of pouring tea. Stories of imperial control and strategy captivated her. She pictured herself with strong men, not simply reading about them. Emperor Taizong himself took notice of her beauty, intellect, and education by the time she turned 14. She became one of the emperor's numerous concubines after being called to the imperial palace. It might have appeared to be a dead end at first. She was only a talented woman among dozens, thus she was ranked fairly low. Wu, however, had no desire to become less noticeable. She was unique, even in a castle full of whispers and silks. She committed the emperor's habits, preferences, and moods to memory. Knowing when to talk and when to disappear behind a curtain taught her the art of silence. Above everything, though, she observed. She observed the use of power, and more significantly, its loss. Wu Zhao also remained calm when Emperor Taizong became ill. She made a plan. She should have been placed in a Buddhist convent after his passing, essentially ending her life. However, destiny, or rather Wu's slyness, had other ideas. The future Emperor Gaozong's son, Li Ji, had already taken notice of her and had not forgotten her. What came next was the first of many small-scale revolutions. Wu Zhao was no longer merely a concubine. She studied power and will soon become its master. The woman who ruled from the dragon throne would be the girl who had formerly been concealed behind a palace screen. However, the empire was ill-prepared for her ascent, which had only just begun. Wu Zhao's next course of action was clearly determined by palace procedure upon the death of Emperor Taizong in 649 CE. She was to be taken to a convent and be mute and shaven-headed for the rest of her life. The majority of ex-concubines quietly resigned themselves to this fate. But Wu Zhao wasn't the most. She had already started a delicate and risky relationship with his son, Li Ji, the new Emperor Gaozong, before Taizong's passing. Their relationship endured the change of leadership, whether it was due to sincere love or cunning planning. Wu Zhao thus returned to the convent almost a year after she had entered, this time as the emperor's covert consort rather than as a cast-off widow. Ironically, Gaozong's wife, the Empress Wang, had planned Wu's comeback. She welcomed Wu Zhao back into the palace in the hopes of diverting the emperor's attention from another rival concubine. She could as well have given her the empire's keys. Wu Zhao performed her new part with icy poise. She had the benefit of having the emperor's sons, which no competitor could match. She gave him more than just heirs, though. She inspired him. Her whispered ideas gradually rewrote the gears of state policy and royal etiquette, and she soon became his closest counselor. The emperor was in love, according to some. Some whispered that he was enchanted. In any case, she was now essential. Then the blood appeared. The conflict between consort Zhao, another preferred concubine, and Empress Wang turned into a quiet war. Tragedy occurred, or was planned, in 654 CE. Unusual circumstances led to the death of Wu Zhao's infant daughter. She charged Empress Wang with homicide. What came next was violent and quick. After being overthrown and put in jail, Wang and Zhao were later disfigured. Empress Wang had her tongue cut out and her limbs chopped off. It was stated that her last screams resembled a pig being killed. Empress Wu Zhao was now in power. Formally, this was not an increase. It was a coup masquerading as fate. Instead of using soldiers, Wu Zhao had become empress by alliances, assassinations, and the gradual loss of her enemy's power. She was more than simply a palace survivor. She made it do her bidding. She wasn't done, though, not even close. She had experienced power. She now wanted the actual throne, above the emperor, not next to it. And that unimaginable goal would begin to come true for the first time in China's lengthy and patriarchal history. Empress Wu was more than just a consort who gave hushed counsel from behind the camera by the late 1960s. She was now the quiet puppeteer of the empire. Emperor Gaozong's health started to deteriorate. His strength and vision both declined. Wu Zhao took advantage of his vulnerability. As his stand-in, she presided over court sessions, issued decrees in his name, and even examined memorials intended solely for the emperor's perusal. Despite knowing the truth, ministers dared not speak it. A woman was now in charge of China. Wu Zhao first exercised cautious rule. She used the teachings of Buddhism to defend her political presence and advocated against the conventional Confucian system. Why couldn't a woman lead the empire after all, since the Buddha had once manifested as a woman? It was political reasoning with a spiritual undertone. She reorganized the bureaucracy, elevating people not by family name but by merit. In a court where aristocratic lineages predominated, this was revolutionary. She was seen as a reformer by those who supported her. She was viewed by her adversaries as a social arsonist who had destroyed centuries of custom. Wu, however, took a long-term approach. She was never a hasty queen. Rather, she waited, eliminating opponents, assembling supporters, and learning the language of statecraft. Like seeds, she sowed informants across the bureaucracy. The imperial secret police were like pruning shears to her. While she continued to appear ostentatiously obedient to the emperor, any officials who disagreed with her were demoted, banished, or put to death. Gaozong passed away in 683. Male dominance should have been reinstated by the natural order. Zhongzong, their son, succeeded to the throne. However, Wu retaliated when he showed signs of independence and dared to give his in-laws significant posts. She demoted him and replaced him with Ruizong, another son who was simpler to manage. As regent and empress dowager, she exercised ultimate power behind the throne. A mother defending her son in his name was the ideal cover for authority. Even the myth of masculine dominance, however, eventually started to fade. "Why would you hide now?" the clergy complained. The scribes of the court murmured. They cautioned that China has never had a female emperor. It wouldn't be natural. Wu Zhao paid attention. Then in secret she started to organize a new dynasty, a new name and a new period of history in which the emperor wore a crown of phoenixes rather than dragons. She wasn't satisfied with ruling in the background. She was prepared to take the light for herself. Wu Zhao ultimately removed the veil in 690 CE. No more sons sitting on the throne with her hand behind their backs, no more proxies. She proclaimed the fall of the Tang dynasty and the establishment of the Zhou dynasty, a new government named after a prosperous period of ancient Chinese history that was chosen with care to conjure up images of morality and legitimacy. Empress Dowager Wu was no longer her name. She was the first and only female emperor of China, Huangdi Wu Zhao. It stunned the court. Citing Confucian classics that described women as submissive, modest, and restricted to the inner chambers, several academics shrank in indignation. Wu Zhao, however, had already revised the guidelines. She surrounded herself with obedient officials, elevated commoners who owed their position to her, and put an end to opposition before it could get traction. She relied on Buddhism to support her mandate. She was proclaimed to be the reincarnation of Maitreya, the future Buddha, and temples were constructed all over the empire. A woman would eventually govern the world and bring about world peace, according to a text that one monk even found. That woman was sitting on the throne, conveniently. She had inscriptions etched in stone that extolled her as celestial monarch and images made of her sitting on the throne with serene authority. It was blatant heresy in a patriarchal society. Nevertheless, it was successful. Wu Zhao used a combination of silk and steel to rule. She made sure that officials were selected based on their abilities rather than their ancestry by fortifying the civil service examination system. She raised state revenue, reduced farmer burdens, and instituted agricultural reforms. The empire was mostly stable and profitable throughout her rule, but there was a cost to her power. Like incense smoke in a shrine, she relied on a covert police network that detected opposition. Court intrigues become more intense. The critics vanished. Behind royal gates, rumors of torture dungeons, forced suicides and executions spread like black incense. She reigned with steely grace, nevertheless. The dragon robe was on her. Her audiences were imperial. She used her own name to issue decrees. Wu Zhao was more than just China's most influential woman for 15 years. The most powerful individual was her. She was never supposed to touch a ladder, yet she had climbed every rung. At the top, she was now by herself. Being the sole female empress of China provided grandeur, but it also made Wu Zhao the center of all the resentment, anxiety, and wounded pride in the realm. She had outwitted generations of aristocrats, disobeyed Confucian decree, and rewritten tradition. And that had one meaning: everybody in silk was waiting and observing her. The court erupted in silent disobedience. At night, ministers who bowed during the day plotted by candlelight. There was no safety, not even among her own children. Her boys, whom she had previously employed as puppets, started to rebel against her total authority. Wu had shown them too well the perils of ambition, but they still want power. She had no faith in any of them. Wu Zhao did more than rule in order to survive. She engaged in an incessant game of chess with her mind. Uncertain charges led to the removal of suspected conspirators. Confessions were frequently coerced, trials were quick, and executions were made public. She was portrayed as ruthless by her adversaries. In reality, though, she was a surgeon. This was not insane, it was a strategy. Within the bureaucracy, she established new ranks. Titles with little power, but an air of grandeur. It was her method of rewarding allegiance without actually ceding control. Additionally, she improved the standing of women in the court by putting loyal concubines and female cousins in positions that would have been unimaginable in previous generations. But as the years passed, her legacy started to take a hit due to her dependence on a small number of important people. Particularly popular were the Zhang brothers, who went from being court entertainment to being political insiders. They gained favor and influence rapidly because they were handsome, personable, and decades younger. This was outrageous to her detractors. Formerly renowned for her sharp mind and brutal authority, the emperor was now viewed as a lone lady clinging to youth in the company of obedient courtiers. Rumors of decadence and corruption started to circulate. However, her achievements could not be erased by such whispers. She oversaw improvements in state infrastructure, civil service examination reform, and literacy rates. Not only had she reigned, but she had done it well. But her health started to deteriorate. Although it was still strong, her hold on power was eroding, and vultures circled behind her, hoping that everything would return to normal, to a throne that was once again governed by a man. Wu Zhao was aware that the end was near. Now the only question was whether it would be treachery or disease. Wu Zhao was in her 70s by the early 700s, which is a very old age for anyone, much less an emperor. Her strength diminished and her body got weaker, but her intellect stayed keen and always aware of the shifting tides of court politics. She continued to reign, but from a recliner behind golden screens, out of sight, and her closest associates started to circle around her like wolves, spotting vulnerability. She became the target of mockery and animosity because of her dependence on the Zhang brothers, Zhang Yizhi and Zhang Changzong. Previously adored favorites, they were now seen as dishonest spies who influenced imperial choices for personal benefit. After tolerating their existence for a long time, ministers started to scheme. The palace finally collapsed around 705 CE. A quick coup was started by a group of generals and high-ranking officials. There was no blood. It was not necessary. The Zhang brothers were ruthlessly executed with their heads on display to the court. As a sign, the Empress was encircled and her allies were taken prisoner. The wings of the phoenix were clipped. Wu Zhao was forced to abdicate due to excessive pressure and declining health. She was compelled to resign and put her son, Zhang Zong, whom she had earlier expelled for having the audacity to think for himself, back on the throne. Even though she abdicated, she kept her title as emperor and continued to have considerable influence behind closed doors despite retreating into retirement and reducing her once vast court to a small retinue. Even though the name of the Chinese throne has changed, Wu Zhao's reign may still be heard in every legislation, policy, and rattled official who is terrified of another woman with ideas. Later that year, she passed away without a lavish burial inscription or a sentimental epitaph. Official histories subtly dropped her name. As if her rule had been a nightmare they didn't want to talk about, the Tang dynasty wiped her out as completely as they could. However, history is hard to quiet, much like Wu Zhao. Poets and academics debated her for decades after her death. Was she a visionary or a usurper, a reformer or a tyrant, a killer or the state's savior? She violated every rule the empire attempted to impose on her. That much is clear. She not only defied history for 15 years, but she also became it. The Tang court acted quickly to end Wu Zhao's extraordinary rule after her death in 705 CE. Her reforms were ascribed to her male successors, and official histories were altered. Records and temples bore her name, but it was scratched out and replaced with safer, more recognizable male names. However, Wu Zhao resisted disappearing in spite of the state's efforts. She was remembered. She could not be ignored by academics. The female emperor, who had formerly controlled the world's greatest empire, was still mentioned by foreign representatives. In an odd turn of events, the historians and academics who were supposed to minimize her legacy were the ones who made sure it survived. A name can be removed, but a reign that influenced a generation cannot. Her achievements were indisputable. She had brought Buddhism to a new level of prominence and established it as a key component of imperial legitimacy. She had reorganized the civil service, decreasing aristocratic nepotism and increasing the meritocracy of tests. Her accomplishments, which most male rulers could only aspire to, included successfully launching military wars, defending the empire's boundaries, and mostly controlling internal revolt. Wu Zhao's rule was also a fleeting, bright star in a dismal sky of oppression for women. She provided women with previously unheard-of access to the levers of power, supported women's education, and appointed women to important posts. Her reign established a legendary precedent, demonstrating that a woman could not only live in but also rule a palace. Her legacy is still complicated, though. She was portrayed by later Confucian historians as a femme fatale who used seduction to gain power and saturated her court with blood, a monster in makeup. Her harshness was inflated to almost demonic levels, her lovers proliferated, and stories of her cruelty were sensationalized. It was simpler to paint her as a villain than to acknowledge that she had fared better than many of her male predecessors. However, contemporary historians have started to weigh the pros and cons. Wu Zhao is now regarded as one of the most successful leaders in Chinese history, regardless of gender, in addition to being a strong woman. Despite its complexity and contradictions, her rule continues to be a masterclass in political survival, ideological manipulation, and statecraft. She reigned during a period when silence was advised. She overcame a system designed to undermine her, and her name continues to burn, silent, strong, and unforgettable, in the ashes of her erasure. Understanding Wu Zhao's rule entails understanding the China she molded via culture, ideology, and identity, in addition to decrees and executions. Her reign was a turning point in society, not just a political oddity. She changed the definition of imperial status to start. Conventional rulers surrounded themselves with army generals and Confucian academics. Wu Zhao, on the other hand, centered her court on Buddhist monks, lowly intellectuals, and fiercely devoted officials who owed their positions to her meritocratic philosophy. The Tang dynasty's power structure was radically changed as a result. Wu Zhao made the civil service examinations more demanding and inclusive. This was a significant departure from the aristocratic monopolies that had ruled since the Han dynasty and gave intellectuals from lower-class, non-noble households more influence. By doing this, she established the foundation for a more vibrant, knowledgeable bureaucracy that would persist long after her passing. She ushered in a golden age of Buddhist building and art. In her name and likeness, temples, pagodas, and enormous statues were built. Wu herself is very similar to the enormous statue of Vairocana Buddha at Longmen Grottoes, regal, serene, and perceptive. These were political monuments as well as religious tributes. The same radical message was whispered by each structure. Cosmic order could be embodied by a lady. The vocabulary of rulership was also altered by her. Numerous new Chinese characters were officially adopted by Wu Zhao. Some were created expressly to exalt her rule, while others were used to convey abstract virtues. The boldness of writing a new script to describe a new administration says volumes about her vision, even though the majority of these characters disappeared during her rule. Her manipulation of gender roles was arguably the most groundbreaking. She combined the personal and the regal by presenting herself as both mother and ruler. She did not openly question masculinity. It became part of her identity. She was both the merciless enforcer and the protective mother, the emperor, the empress, and the dragon. Her empire was not flawless. Dissension was severely penalized. Trust was an uncommon commodity, but under her it worked, changed, and grew. And it is undeniable even in the face of decades of opposition to her legacy. Wu Zhao transformed the Tang dynasty in addition to ruling it. Even though Wu Zhao passed away more than 1,300 years ago, her rule continues to reverberate across Chinese culture, an eerie tune of genius, cruelty, and audacious defiance. Time has a way of bringing to light things that history tries to conceal, even though her name was once scuffed from stone and exiled from official records. She turned into a conundrum in the centuries that followed. She was depicted as anything from a ruthless seductress to a celestial monarch in popular legend. Her life was dramatized by opera companies, who at times portrayed her as a brutal ruler and at other times as a tragic heroine. Despite being misunderstood, sanctified, and vilified, she was never forgotten. Her crown and climb have never been equaled by any woman in Chinese history. None ever proclaimed themselves emperors, but others held positions of authority as regents or dowagers. None dared to take the most powerful throne in the world by themselves, change language, or rebuild dynasties. And the fact that she violated the unbreakable rule has left a legacy that still sparks discussion. She continues to serve as a warning to some. The peril of unbridled ambition and armored femininity. Others, however, particularly contemporary feminists, political theorists, and historians, see her as something very different. A monument to the price and repercussions of taking on leadership roles you were never meant to, a testament to tenacity, and an example of unadulterated political brilliance. Wu Zhao is still more than just a historical figure today. She is a reflection. You can see the churning gears of systematic injustice in her eyes, as well as the moment they were jammed during her rule. She destroyed expectations rather than merely defying them. She did, however, pay a price for her greatness. Moral uncertainty still taints her legacy. She employed terror just as much as justice. Her adversaries not only perished in shame, but occasionally went untried, their voices forgotten in the annals of antiquity. Her justice was calculated, her compassion selective. Although she wasn't a saint, she never made an effort to be one. Wu Zhao ruled to survive, not to win favor. and she created history by surviving. So she stays. The female emperor who emerged from the obscurity of concubinage entered a world that rejected her and responded with a throne. She crowned herself the phoenix in a land of dragons, and she seared her name forever in that flame. A road was more than simply a practicality in the ancient world. It was a symbol of authority. Control, not ease of passage, was the primary consideration when a monarch ordered a route to be cut through a mountain, desert, or woodland. Roads were a moving empire. Roads were man-made, in contrast to rivers and oceans, which were determined by nature. They reminded everyone, from merchants to rebels, that civilization had reached far and wide, cutting through the landscape and connecting far-flung outposts to capitals. Fast troop movement, effective tax collection, and the transportation of supplies from the frontier to the center of the empire were all made possible by a good road. Around 4000 BCE, the earliest roadways were discovered in Mesopotamia. These were compacted dirt roads used by carts and trade caravans rather than concrete roadways. Societies understood something important even at that time. Ideas, products, and influence travel with people, and the person who creates the path controls the flow. From Sardis to Susa, the regal road in ancient Persia spanned more than 1,500 kilometers. It featured royal couriers who could race across the empire in record time, as well as way stations and rest spots. According to Herodotus, a message might cover its entire distance in 7 days. That speed was frightening as well as amazing. The king's speech could now be heard throughout the empire in a matter of days rather than weeks. However, the road was refined as an imperial tool by the Romans. In the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe, they constructed more than 50,000 miles of stone-paved roadways. These roads were straight, strong, and incredibly well-engineered. Their purpose was efficiency, not aesthetics. Grain supplies, imperial messengers, and marching troops all relied on its stone for support. Roman roads had an equally revolutionary effect on civilians, as they did on military ones. Farmers could reach markets with their products. It was safe for travelers to move between regions. Cities were connected not only by politics but also by sweat and stone. The road was always about transformation rather than merely transit in every significant civilization, because constructing a road meant changing the land and the authority that governed it. Rome was the engineering superpower of the ancient world, and their greatest asset was not just the arch or the aqueduct, but also the road. Roman roads served as the foundation of an empire, not only a means of transportation. All roads lead to Rome was a logistical statement rather than a metaphor. More than 50,000 miles of stone-laid, skillfully drained, and arrow-straight roads were constructed by the Romans. They linked the Rhine to the Danube, Britain to Egypt, and all of the strategically important military outposts in between. The empire seemed more manageable, quicker, and smaller thanks to these roadways. A formula was followed by Roman engineers. They started by selecting a path which was frequently the straightest but not always the simplest. Surveying followed, employing instruments such as the groma for distance and right angles. They started excavating as soon as the path was established. As with a cake of conquest, a Roman road was constructed in layers. Large stones make up the statumen, the lowest stratum. Rudus, a mixture of crushed stone and lime, came above that. The nucleus, a layer of crushed gravel or sand, came next. Last but not least is the summum dorsum, a paved surface made up of interlocking stone slabs that is frequently topped in the middle to allow for water runoff. A path that could last generations of weather, hooves and sandals was the end result. Although engineering was just half the tale, some are still in use today. Roman roads included rest areas, mile markers, infrastructure, and mansiones, or way stations, where messengers and officials could rest and replenish. These routes were used by Rome's messenger service, the cursus publicus, to transport communications around the empire at an incredible rate, in certain circumstances almost 50 miles each day. Additionally, the roadways transported legions in addition to mail. Whether it was a revolt in Gaul or a battle in Judea, Roman soldiers were able to move hundreds of miles more quickly than their adversaries anticipated. Roads developed into a stealthy, sturdy, and constantly moving extension of Rome's military might. However, settlers followed soldiers, and towns followed settlers. Roads promoted migration, trade, and the dissemination of Roman architecture, language, and law. They were arteries that pumped both conquest and civilization. A road was not a luxury for Rome, rather it was a necessity, a sign, a stone inscription that declared the arrival of Rome. And the world shifted beneath their feet wherever Rome constructed. The Inca Empire constructed roadways in the sky, whereas Rome constructed them out of stone. The Chapacñan, the vast Inca road system, was a feat of Andean engineering that spanned more than 25,000 miles. It connected deserts, jungles, and mountains rising above 13,000 feet, tying together one of the world's most difficult terrain. And the Incas accomplished all of this without the use of a wheel, draft animals other than llamas, or European-style metal equipment. This was the backbone of an empire, not just a network of roads. Cusco, the Inca capital, was in the center of it all. The roadways connected agricultural centers, military outposts, religious locations, and provincial centers, radiating out like spokes on a sunwheel. The Inca Trail, which leads to Machu Picchu, is the most well-known section, yet it was only one link in a huge imperial web. The roads differed in construction and size. They were broad and stone-paved in the lowlands. They were sometimes only a foot wide, winding routes carved into rocks in the high highlands. The Incas used woven grass to construct rope suspension bridges where rivers flowed, which were sturdy enough to hold people and llamal caravans. Every year these bridges had to be rebuilt, a custom that is still practiced in some regions of Peru. Wheeled carts were absent. The Incas used llamas or foot for all forms of transportation, but they also used chasqui or relay runners, which were even more effective. Every few miles these couriers ran between tambos or rest stops. The emperor in Cusco could receive food, fresh fish, and even messages from the coast in a few days. Despite the absence of written script, this technique enabled the empire to operate at an incredible pace. The roads were spiritual, though. Many adhered to seques, which were holy routes that extended from Cusco to mountains and shrines. Travel served a symbolic as well as utilitarian purpose. Every action strengthened religious concord and imperial order. A Roman-style conquest machine was not what the Chapacñan was. A vertical kingdom was held together by this rope. Though much of it has since disappeared, certain sections remain, with stones laid without cement, still bearing footprints after 500 years. The roadways allowed for unification between snow-capped peaks and coastal deserts. The Andes were not the only region the Incas conquered. One path at a time, they pieced it together. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, which existed centuries before Rome, and distant from the Andes, used stone and cunning to bind together its enormous realm. At its center was the 1,500-mile engineering feat known as the Royal Road, which connected Susa, one of the Persian capitals, with Sardis in Lydia, present-day Turkey. The Royal Road, which Darius the Great commissioned in the 5th century BCE, served purposes beyond transportation. It was one of the first real long-distance highways in history, a political conduit, and an example of imperial ingenuity. Although the Persians did not create roads, they did standardize, militarize, and establish them as the cornerstone of bureaucracy. By avoiding marshes and climbing mountains when needed, their engineers surveyed routes that struck a compromise between directness and terrain. A unexpectedly quick and seamless connectivity across an empire spanning continents was the end outcome. According to Herodotus, a normal traveller would have needed roughly 90 days to traverse the entire royal road, but royal messengers could do so in 7 days. How? The relay station system. There were posting stations with new supplies and horses every 15 to 18 miles. The system used by couriers, which predated the Pony Express by more than 2,000 years, involved switching horses and continuing to ride at maximum pace. However, messengers weren't the only users of these pathways. They were continuously employed by tax collectors, ambassadors, military forces, and merchants. A multi-ethnic empire comprising Greeks, Medes, Egyptians, Babylonians, and others was woven together by the royal road. In the ancient world, it enabled something remarkable: central control over far-flung provinces. Caravanserais offered food and shelter, while road guards made sure everyone was safe. The Persian bureaucracy excelled at order and maintenance, which were essential to the functioning of the entire system. Tolls were occasionally collected at mountain passes or river crossings, and road staff were sent out to repair damage. Road markers and milestones, which are instruments for gauging distance and guaranteeing uniformity across areas, were also invented by the Persians. Later, Byzantium and Rome would adopt similar customs. Although the royal road was not whole when Persia fell, its impact persisted. It was employed to invade the empire by Alexander the Great. Later, the Romans developed the idea further. Parts of its historic path are still followed by contemporary roadways. It proved to be a strong concept. Swords alone do not govern an empire. It is determined by the message's speed and the strength of the path it takes. While the Incas were blazing tracks through the Andes and the Romans were laying stone in Europe, another empire, Han Dynasty China, was covertly constructing a road system that would change the course of history. They had roads that connected more than simply cities. They helped to build a civilization and fueled the development of the Silk Road, one of the most fabled trading networks in human history. Roads were used for growth and control during the Han Dynasty, particularly under Emperor Wu-R, R 141-87 BCE. From the imperial capital of Chang'an into Central Asia, the government invested heavily in building and maintaining long-distance routes. Merchants were not the only users of these roadways. They served as essential administrative and military conduits. Han roads were not consistently stone-paved like Roman roads were. Many were made of gravel or hard-packed earth, often supplemented with stone slabs in high-traffic areas or planks in muddy places. However, their organization and size more than made up for their lack of standard engineering. The Yichuan, a postal relay system, was extremely sophisticated. Stations with new horses and space for government messengers were set up at regular intervals. This made it possible for tax records and imperial decrees to move very quickly over thousands of miles. These roadways facilitated trade, diplomacy, and governance. Contact with cultures as far away as India and Persia was made possible by emissaries like Zhang Qian, who traveled westward into Central Asia. Paper, spices, jade, and silk poured outward. China gained innovative agricultural concepts, glassware, and horses in exchange. Safety was crucial. The Han made significant investments in keeping up military outposts along the routes, particularly in the vicinity of the Gansu Corridor, a wind-swept, thin stretch of terrain that served as a gateway between China and the West. The road was lined by walled communities, beacon mounds, and watchtowers, forming a mesh of imperial presence. In terms of culture, the road system made it possible for administrative procedures, Buddhism, and Confucianism to proliferate throughout various geographical areas. In addition to bringing commodities and ideas, travelers, monks, soldiers, and merchants helped to create a cohesive identity that would endure long beyond the Han. Han roads were constructed to last, not to dazzle. Their legacy persisted even though many of them disappeared under newer cities or were reclaimed by the desert and dust. Because China established a portal to the world with these highways, not only to protect its borders. Seldom are the roads of ancient Greece praised. They did not extend extensive networks like the Persians or construct magnificent highways like the Romans. However, what they did construct, albeit on a smaller scale, shows how roads might influence not only trade and conflict, but also identity, culture, and religion. Road construction was challenging and costly in Greece due to its rough, hilly environment. The Greeks thus created a patchwork of stone-paved local roadways in place of imperial highways, frequently linking city-states rather than uniting a huge empire. These roads were usually tiny, only large enough for chariots or pack animals, and they followed the natural topography. They were important in the Greek world nonetheless, in spite of their simplicity. The holy road from Athens to Eleusis, which was utilized during the Eleusinian Mysteries, religious celebrations honoring Demeter and Persephone, was one of the most well-known roads. Every year, thousands of initiates bring offerings and chant hymns as they march down this route in a magnificent procession. For them, the road was more than just a route. It was a rite of passage, a voyage into mystery and metamorphosis from the world of the living. The Pan-Hellenic road, which led to Delphi, the home of the Oracle of Apollo, was another famous route. To consult the oracle, pilgrims, kings, and philosophers traveled this convoluted route over valleys and mountains. Treasury buildings, shrines, and inscribed stones were found along the route, creating a spiritual as well as a physical journey. Greek roads were frequented by businessmen, philosophers, and soldiers, in addition to being considered sacred. Consider Xenophon's Anabasis, which chronicles the grueling road-bound expedition of Greek mercenaries' protracted withdrawal through Persia. Or think of Socrates, who frequently made his way from the agora to the academy or the lyceum to lecture outside, his feet following well-worn routes of discussion and argument. Greek highways were unique because of their incorporation into everyday life rather than their engineering. They developed naturally as a result of marketplaces, sanctuaries, and social customs, rather than being constructed by emperors to demonstrate their power. And thoughts moved through them as quickly as soldiers or wagons. Theatre, philosophy, democracy, and even Olympic competitors traveled over dusty, winding routes that winded through city gates and olive groves. Despite their simplicity, Greek roadways bore the weight of a civilization that, by intellect rather than force, altered the course of history. Roads served as vital conduits for spiritual life, imperial governance, and cross-cultural interaction in ancient India, in addition to being commercial routes. Indian civilizations created an exceptionally well-organized road system that linked agricultural river valleys, coastal ports, trading towns, and sacred cities, starting with the Mauryan Empire in the 3rd century BCE and continuing through the Gupta era. The Buddhist emperor Ashoka, who ruled over most of the subcontinent from 268 to 232 BCE, was the one who had the biggest impact on ancient Indian roadways. Roads formed a key component of Ashoka's shift away from warfare and toward public welfare after the brutal Kalinga War. Throughout his empire, Ashoka commanded the building and extension of roadways. These weren't merely dirt roads, they were purposefully constructed routes that frequently contained rest stops for travelers, wells for water, and trees for shade. Along the roadways, he erected pillars of inscribed stone to proclaim edicts that called for compassion, honesty, and religious tolerance rather than to indicate distances. It was visibility-based governance. The most well-known of these routes connected the Ganges Plain to modern-day Pakistan and Afghanistan via Pataliputra, or Patna, and continued to the northwest boundary. Later, this section joined the northern trade route that would develop into the Silk Road, which connected China, Persia, and the Greco-Roman civilization with India. Indian highways conveyed beliefs and ideologies in addition to goods. To disseminate their teachings, Buddhist monks traversed these highways. They were used by Hindu visitors to travel between temples and holy waterways. Even Jain gurus used these paths for silent reflection. The roadways evolved into conceptual bridges. Trade was booming. Products from the eastern coast, such as textiles, gems, ivory, and spices, made their way inland and outward from the coast to Roman ports and markets in Central Asia. Roads connected major cities that were centers of trade and education, such as Varanasi, Ujjain, and Taxila. Despite the fact that many Indian roads lacked Roman pavement, they were regularly maintained, particularly prior to the monsoon season. To avoid flooding, engineers employed packed dirt, gravel, and wood boards, frequently raised a little. The distinctive feature of India's old road system was plurality rather than coercion. Scholars, farmers, kings, and saints all benefited from roads. In addition to linking empires, they also linked worldviews, and in that combination of political, spiritual, and economic goals, India created not only highways but also avenues for influence that would extend well beyond its boundaries. Ancient highways were engineering marvels that crossed rivers, gorges, and rough terrain rather than being merely level routes that ran over the landscape. Civilizations had to become experts in drainage, bridge construction, and long-lasting building techniques in order to develop efficient highways. Bridge engineering was invented by the Romans. Their highways frequently used stone arch bridges which could sustain large loads and last for millennia to cross enormous rivers. Two excellent examples are the Alcantara Bridge in Spain and the Ponte Milvio in Rome. The Roman arch distributed weight precisely by using keystones and meticulously cut stones. In addition to being useful, their bridges were emblems of imperial might that inspired reverence and awe. However, the Romans weren't the only ones. The Incas constructed rope suspension bridges out of braided grasses and vines in response to untamed rivers that sliced across Andean gorges. These bridges were extremely robust while being lightweight, and local communities repaired them every year in customs that are still followed today. Crossing these bridges bound communities to the land and to one another, posing a cultural as well as physical challenge. Engineers in ancient China created beam and pontoon bridges. The world's oldest open spandrel stone segmental arch bridge is the well-known Zhao Bridge, which was constructed during the Sui dynasty and finished in 605 CE. For centuries, it enabled massive traffic to cross the Jing River by fusing exquisite engineering with beautiful elegance. Drainage was just as important. Roman roads had ditches on either side and were capped in the middle to swiftly drain rainfall. Roads in Southeast Asia and India, which are prone to monsoons and rain, were frequently raised on causeways or covered with gravel layers to avoid washouts. To guarantee endurance, some empires even constructed roadways using many layers of materials, including compacted earth, stones, gravel, and paving slabs. In addition to bridges and drainage, way stations and mile markers, earlier iterations of highway rest stops were built along historic roadways to offer travelers rest, supplies, and direction. These technical marvels influenced economics, military, and culture, in addition to making travel easier. An army's ability to cross into enemy territory or be stopped cold could depend on a bridge. A city's ability to survive through trade and communication may depend on how well maintained its roads are. In the end, the creation of ancient roads was a manifestation of human creativity and a record of how cultures changed and adapted to their surroundings in order to transport people, products, and ideas across wide-ranging terrain. Ancient highways served as more than just routes throughout history. They were the vital conduits that enabled civilizations to flourish, grow, and last. Roads allowed trade, communication, and cultural exchange that characterized civilizations by connecting far-flung cities and isolated villages. Empires realized that without effective roads, merchants could not thrive, governors could not enforce the law, and armies could not move swiftly. In addition to promoting urban growth and shaping commercial centers, roads have had an impact on the spread of ideologies and religions. In addition to carrying goods, the Silk Road, the Roman Via Appia, and the Incan Capac Ñan also carried identities and ideas. Large bureaucracies and committed labor forces were needed to maintain these, demonstrating the organizational skills of civilizations such as the Incas, China, Persia, and Rome. Roads came to represent the stability and extent of an empire. Empires thrived when highways were kept in good condition. Neglected areas drifted into deterioration, rebellion, or isolation. Roads, however, also represent human ambition and the need to connect, govern, and communicate over large areas. They demonstrate how early leaders and engineers saw terrain as a canvas to be reshaped, rather than merely a barrier. Many old routes are now under highways, while others are still treasures from archaeology. They serve as a reminder that the infrastructure we frequently take for granted was once a huge undertaking made possible by labor, stone, wood, and creativity. Every trip we take, every message we send, and every trade channel connecting our more interconnected world all carry on the tradition of old highways. They are the unseen creators of civilization, culture, and empire. The history of ancient roadways is essentially the history of humanity as a whole, constantly moving forward and constructing bridges, both real and symbolic, across space and time.